Hello and welcome to the Salt of the Earth podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Cobb, and this is my co-host,
Thomas.
And it's just the two of us today. So, today's a little bit less scripted, or a little less...
By which he means we didn't prepare at all, of course.
Yeah, it's even less than normal. But we do have a topic that both of us are kind of, or at least I am, and I think you are too, probably. Feel like we like to talk about, and I think I have a lot of things to say on it, so.
We're passionate about it. We got ideas.
Yeah.
Something like that. So the topic in question is the question, why are so many young people leaving the church?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it a trend? And this is probably going to be a much more opinion-focused podcast, I would say.
Yeah.
We're just going to be kind of discussing why we think it might be, and
Mm-hmm.
It'll be a lot of our thoughts. We'll try to get in some scripture as much as we can.
Yeah, and obviously you might have different opinions than us, and you might know people with different opinions, and so we're not going to say that anything we say is absolute, obviously.
Right.
So, but from our perspective, this is what we believe, or why we think it is. And then we'll also probably talk about some approaches that different churches are taking, and why they may be working or not working,
Mm-hmm.
and what the real solutions are.
All right. So, and one more disclaimer, I guess, is thinking about trying to answer the question why people, specifically young people, leave the church so much. It's the kind of thing where just being men with our limited points of view, we can't really answer definitively because there's, a ton of reasons. There's a lot of reasons, and we're going to just say the ones that we think are
Most obvious to us.
are most obvious to us and that we think make the biggest impact. Really, it's just there's a whole smattering of reasons why it could be or could not be. I don't know.
And everybody's situation is unique and complex, but as a whole, there are some things that we see as factors.
Okay, enough of that. Let's get started. Jonathan, why do you think? What do you think is a reason why young people are leaving the church?
Okay, so as we talked about before we started recording,
Which you didn't hear.
it comes from. Well, okay, I'll go. So I think when people are younger, they're more susceptible to seeing things like hypocrisy and younger people tend to be more questioning of everything. I think
They're not set in their ways.
they're not set in their ways.
They're still finding their ways.
And so that's both a positive and a negative. Obviously, you don't want to be all over the place with your beliefs. That's not a good thing to fall into. But also, you don't want to be stuck in a certain belief and possibly turn away.
And be unwilling to question it.
And be unwilling to change if that comes up. So I think it's, in my opinion, just a natural course for young people to be more questioning and explorative, and older people to be more firm and steady. Just in general, I think it's how. That's my view or my understanding of the world. So different things in the church that people that have been in the church for 5, 10, 20 years may not even think about or notice. Younger people can notice it. It's very obvious to them. If it's a small hypocrisy or a small or big hypocrisy or just a lack of depth.
Or a tradition that has lost all of its meaning.
Yeah. And younger people tend to see that, and they don't see these older people that are leaders in the church trying to do anything about it. And so then they start to feel like the church is...
I think they kind of conclude based on that it's kind of a hoax almost.
Yeah.
It's well, you people all say, you're living your lives for Christ and that you're totally devoted, but then they look around and see how most people don't actually spend very much of their time following Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
And numerous other things like that. They look around and they see people saying one thing and acting and living in a completely different way, and they're like, well, if the Christians I'm seeing are like this, do I want to be a Christian?
Yeah.
It's a natural line of thought.
And some people are obviously in better churches than other people, but when we are questioning our faith, we may be looking at just the people in our church and saying and thinking that like if these Christians, particular Christians, are like this, then are the people that converted me into Christ, are they just bad Christians, or is this just a hoax as a whole?
Mm-hmm.
And people often probably lean towards the latter and assume that as a whole it's just a hoax. Mm-hmm. And rather than assuming that maybe these people just have problems, even though they're the ones that taught me everything I know about Christianity and converted me. And so that's if you're going into a church as an outsider from a different church, you might be less likely to think that way. You may see the problems of these specific people rather than just thinking Christianity as a whole has these specific problems.
I think that seeing Christianity as a whole is probably more of a thing that people who just non-Christians would do.
Yeah.
They'd see the Christianity as a whole as, and we've talked about this before, they're judgmental, they're negative, they are hypocritical, they're divided. I know especially like hypocritical is one that people will think of when they think of the church, and they'll probably have a few very good examples actually of Christians who have displayed that behavior in their life, and it just took those few examples to just kind of turn them off of it, and it's pretty sad.
Yeah. And everybody has struggles, obviously, and probably different congregations might struggle with different things. And it's obviously we are humans, so we make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And then that leads to somebody going to a church and be converted into church, and then once they've started reading the Bible more, they'll start to understand like this is a way that they're not really following the Bible in this church. I think then that could lead them to the conclusion that this is fake. Mm-hmm. At least that, yeah.
It's definitely a possibility. So back to the idea of young people. So people inside the church leaving, they more or less see that same. They see the examples around them, which would be usually just within their church, and they see people who are not living like they're saying, basically. Or maybe I think it's also possible that like when a teen or someone is like really for the first time getting really active into Christianity and into their faith and reading the Bible a lot and stuff, that they might like get extremely zealous and like want to do the best possible job, and then realize that nobody else is like that, and then just kind of get turned off of it. They kind of follow the pattern of like the rocky soil. Is once they reach a certain age, they like get super into it, and then get really discouraged that nobody else is super into it.
Yeah, once they get to that level, then they start to look around more and realize, wait a second, I'm not going to be the only one that's going to be putting this level. I don't want to be the only one that's putting forward this level of effort, or whatever.
And also they think just like if everyone should be putting this level of effort, right? And if everyone isn't, then maybe it's a hoax.
Yeah, and then that leads to discouragement, and that can lead to falling away.
I think that's definitely a danger that a lot of young people and even slightly older people, getting past college age even, is they get super devoted and they have this standard for what they think a good Christian should be like. Like maybe that involves like, multiple hours of prayer a day, or just devoting their entire life, and they see that as being like way too hard. And so then they decide, well, maybe that's not the way, and they just kind of fall back. I mean, I know I've probably seen some examples of that, and felt, almost felt the, like the possibility myself, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It. Yeah. Hypocrisy is like is probably like one of the biggest things. It's just it could be people's. It could be like, in particular, like somebody in authority, like a preacher or somebody who obviously says all these things in their sermon, and then you may be able to see in their lives they don't do these things.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could be like something that's wrong with how your church is up, or what your doctrinally wrong, and
Yeah.
and you read in the Bible and you see that, and it's perfectly obvious to you, and then you
maybe confront someone about it, and then they say something like, "Oh, it doesn't matter. They don't want to change," and then
and then as a young person, you kind of like, okay, this is not my responsibility though to fix this,
mm-hmm.
and then you kind of realize that nobody else, even the elders, are doing anything to fix this either.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I pointed to earlier, it's harder for them to notice this type of thing than it is for you.
Yeah.
Just because they've been gotten used to it. It doesn't excuse it, obviously, but like,
I think that's also kind of what you're talking about, like people like noticing it and then wanting it to change it themselves. That can also be dangerous in itself, because they might like do that from a matter of like pride, like, oh, like I can be the one who changes it, or like then they can kind of pridefully approach elders or something and be like, here, you need to change, and that's not a good way to do it either. But
yeah, it doesn't look like it happens very often, because it's kind of a daunting task to take on. But
yeah,
and younger people can probably, I would imagine, could feel like helpless in a situation where they think, oh, okay, this church is going wrong in this, but there's nothing really I can do about it.
mm-hmm.
And that can be discouraging.
And I think what needs to happen is they need to find, people they can share their feelings with about it. Probably it'd be best if it was someone older and more spiritually mature, but someone who they can trust and who will listen to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And talk to, so they're not alone, and like,
yeah.
And hopefully it'll be someone who will actually listen to them and like honestly consider like, we could be doing better on this, and then stand with them in some way.
Mm-hmm. And it also could be that they've misunderstood something, and then they've had this whole like mental thing for nothing.
Ooh, we just lost a light.
Hang on.
You're in the dark.
They got more batteries, so.
And here I thought I grabbed good ones. Welcome to the Thomas Show, where we don't have any Jonathans, except for now he's in part of the frame. Just ignore him. Look at my face.
Ooh, this was dead too.
We may have a repeat in a few minutes. Now, thinking of hypocrisy, I think so far we've been talking about it in the church. I think actually one of the biggest areas of hypocrisy that leads younger people to go astray is actually the family. Before even the church, is they can just look within their own family and see their parents who maybe, say like, we follow Christ, we're devoted and things like this. But then they know firsthand how their parents spend the majority of their time, right? Mm. And it's probably, probably in a lot of cases, it's not that they're not that devoted to Christ. Actually, they spend most of their time like a non-Christian would, and they go to church and they maybe have some family Bible studies or something. But the overall, I think the parents are especially where it starts, because they're kind of like the biggest authority figures in a young person's life, right? And if your parents are being hypocritical in some way about it, then as soon as you move away and you don't have your parents forcing you to go to church or, bringing you to church, as soon as you move away, then all of a sudden you're going to realize, well, like my parents, they pretty much lived like non-Christians with church tacked on, I can live like a much better non-Christian without church. Like, why take up my Sunday mornings? So a lot of times the falling away happens when kids move away or go to college or something like that. It's because now they're finally on their own. Now they're making their own decisions, and
yeah, and it comes back to the path of least resistance.
mm-hmm.
When they were in when they were in high school or their parents' house, no matter how devoted or they were,
There we go again.
they took the path of least resistance and just went to church, and then afterwards they also took the path of least resistance and didn't go to church. So
Mm-hmm. They had to kind of confront their faith on their own, and since they didn't have the kind of weak tradition of, oh, well, you go to church every Sunday anymore, since they didn't have to do that anymore, they don't.
Oh, and then maybe the parents went based off of tradition, and as we talked about earlier, young people aren't as affected by tradition.
So I think another thing that, kind of a pivotal thing that happens when someone moves away from their parents is, up until that point, they may have gotten baptized, they may have come to Christ, but they may not have really established their own faith. They're kind of piggybacking on their parents' faith, and until they're out on their own, they have to make all of their own decisions, or most of their own decisions anyway. Until that point, they haven't really decided for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And you can decide for yourself really strongly even before you move away. You can do that. I think in a lot of cases it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But it's very easy, especially growing up, and especially if you're like a preacher's kid or something like that, to kind of assume like, oh, I grew up in a good Christian family, or my dad's a preacher or something like that. Therefore, I am also going to be a good Christian. And they just assume that they're always going to be that the way they currently are. And so then they don't really have their own faith. They kind of piggyback on their parents' faith, and then when that's taken away, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
When it's taken away, they have not yet fully dedicated themselves on their own, and you have to do it on your own. Because nobody else can make a saving decision for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I said that's something I was thinking about. It's kind of like a pivotal thing is that, well, even you think like the Hebrews, Jesus was talking to them, and he's, they took such great stock in the fact that they were descendants of Abraham, and they a lot of times thought that because they were descendants of Abraham, they were in the right. They were God's chosen people, right? Mm. And then, some of the things Jesus said to them were like, well, like, I say to you, like, God is able to raise up children of Abraham from these stones. And similar things to the effect of, like, your parents aren't going to get you into heaven. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if you're a preacher's kid or not.
Yeah, at some point you have to have your own faith. It's completely independent of your parents.
Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, well, we think of growing up in a Christian household or being a preacher's kid as being like a really big advantage. And it is an advantage insofar as like you're growing up, you are strongly exposed to the scripture and to the existence of God, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you grew up in some households, you wouldn't get that. So it is somewhat of an advantage, but it isn't an advantage in that you still have to make all the same decisions yourself.
Yeah.
You still have to get to the same place as if you didn't grow up in a Christian household, except you're much more liable to thinking that you've already gotten there. Mm-hmm. That's the way I see it.
So here's an interesting question for you, or like a thought. Some churches, it could be the same churches that can have incredible success at outreach and ministry to new people that struggle with keeping the kids in the church. I think it can happen. and I think you. Well, I guess do you have any like thoughts off the top of your head why that might be?
Yeah. So a church that is really good at outreaching and getting new people, well, I guess it really depends on how they're outreaching and getting new people. Because if the ways that they're trying to draw new people in are by having a really great speakers or a really good band or all kinds of fun programs for, every age level, if that's the way that they're drawing people in, then all these kind of extra superficial things, then the people are being drawn in for those things. They're not being drawn in for God. They're not being drawn in for the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the kids growing up, they have all those fun things, but they haven't really been. I mean, they can they can look around and see the hypocrisy that a lot of the people are there for all these extra things. They're not here for, God so much.
Yeah.
Francis Chan put it really well in one of his books. He asked one of his daughters, for her birthday party, if we just had cake and nothing else, no games, no events, no parties, no anything, and we invited your friends, how many people do you think would come to your birthday party? And she said, maybe a couple. So there may be a couple people who would come just to spend time with her. Nothing fun besides that. And then he asked, so what if we rented out a party place or whatever, like Chuck E. Cheese's or something, with unlimited tokens, free pizza, cake, all this kind of stuff. How many people do you think would come up? And she's like, well, probably my whole school. And so, okay, what if, and then he asked his daughter, what if at this party, having all these fun things, I came and asked you, man, don't you just really feel loved? Look at all the people that came to see you. And the idea being, well, the people did not come to see her, right?
Yeah.
They would have come for all the extra things, And so I think in the same way for churches, and this is the point Francis Chan also made, in churches, when we try to draw people in by all these superficial, man-made ways, we are not drawing them in to God. We're drawing them in to be entertained or to, all these various things.
Mm-hmm.
And so then kids growing up, they eventually, a lot of them likely see kind of the hypocrisy in that and see that, well, this is entertainment, this is not something real. Then they see that and they're like, well, I can find entertainment in the world. I don't need to go to church to get this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And then what I was going to say with that question, is that when you're say you're trying to reach out to a non-Christian, you're part of this church and you're trying to reach out to a non-Christian, what do? You try to build a relationship with them. You try to disciple them into Christ, right?
Mm-hmm. Ideally,
and eventually you might become like a mentor figure to them over time, just because, or maybe somebody else in the church will, if you maybe you pass them out to somebody else for Bible study. We see this in our church all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody will maybe reach out to a coworker, and then they're like, oh, they contact this other person. Oh, can you mentor them or something like that? Something to that effect. But we view kids that have their parents already come to church as being Christians already. Or at least that's kind of how it feels like we view them.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do that same process with them. We just kind of we just let them do whatever. We just send them to Sunday school and then that's it.
It's true.
We should, I think the solution to this is we should start viewing kids as non-Christians effectively.
Yeah.
And we have to reach out to them the same way, because just because they've absorbed...
Kids need mentors too.
Just because they've absorbed the base level of, just because they've been at church and absorbed stuff does not mean that they've been taught.
Yeah, that's a good point. Oh no. Those lights too. Technical difficulties, but now we're done. I think a really dangerous thing that it's kind of a problem with just how we treat children in general, in a lot of churches, is we view them as separate than adults. They're in their own section and they have all their own classes. But we don't view them as we don't really view them as Christians, as full Christians, and we don't really view them as non-Christians.
Yeah.
They're just kind of like mini Christians that are expected to become Christians.
Yeah.
By default.
Yeah.
And
a lot of them do, but it may be a very shallow faith.
A lot of them do, and then a lot of them leave too.
Yeah, exactly.
It's, I mean, I just know that from some of the Bible camps that I've been to in the past and some of the youth groups and things, high percentage of people have just left the church totally. And that's a very sad thing, because I look around and a lot of the peers that I grew up with are no longer Christians, and we have to wonder why. Like, what's the problem here? And I guess that's kind of part of the reason of this episode. We're not going to find the solution, but we're at least thinking about it, talking about it.
Yeah.
I think one of the dangers with that is that we're treating kids completely differently. We're treating them almost as subpar. We're not putting as much value into mentoring them and growing them into full adult Christians.
Yeah.
I think, well, like, we mentor adults that come into the church, right? We try to set up mentors for them anyway and disciple them, but there's not that level of intentionality with younger people. Sorry, go ahead.
It's kind of an awkward thing, because at some point you have to make the transition between, like, they're at some point when they're really young, obviously they can't really comprehend a lot of things. But at some point you got to start thinking, okay, at this point they're like a non-Christian. They may have some basic understandings that maybe but could be possibly be warped, depending on how they perceive things. And we need to mentor them into a relationship with Christ while they're still in the church.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes it a lot easier for sure. And now I just expect that they'll get a good understanding through Sunday school and whatnot.
And even children who do come to Christ, the same thing needs to happen, because otherwise there's nothing saying that they're going to stay. They're gonna stay going to church. They're gonna stay followers.
Yeah.
And I know there's especially this really awkward time as a kid growing up. I know I felt it. It's like, where you're deciding, do I keep going to like the teen class or whatever, or do I start attending like the adult Sunday school or whatever? There's like this awkward period where you're like, well, I've been baptized for years. I'm a Christian, but at what point do I become like a full like adult Christian?
Yeah.
It's kind of this awkward thing, and I think that disconnect could be solved if there was proper mentoring in between. If an older, more mature Christian, maybe not too old, but older and more mature, would mentor younger people and kind of bridge that gap and bring them in, I guess. Mm-hmm. I think that what Jesus said, his apostles didn't fully get this. They were trying to keep children away from Jesus, but Jesus says, no, let them come to me. And he said things like, I'm going to get it wrong, but for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these, essentially. And I think another time he worded it more like, I don't know. Something to the effect that there's kind of something that children have that adults don't have, that we lose at some point. And I think we kind of undervalue that in children, and we treat them as subpar, and they could, as long as they have significantly or have adequately developed their mental faculties, right? There's no reason why they can't do all the things an adult Christian can. Mm-hmm. They have less experience, less wisdom, but I think we could start working them into doing more at a much earlier age. And that would prevent them from falling away, because they'd be taking a more active part. They would be developing their own faith much more sincerely than they're going to at Sunday school.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what that looks like.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, it's just kind of or it's kind of weird that we should put all this focus into non-Christians outside the church, but not into non-Christians inside the church.
And we do put focus on.
We do put focus
on kids, but it'll take the form of like a VBS,
yeah,
or some sort of program or something where we have like
it's all
a
about
couple extra classes and some more fun activities.
And we've talked about this a lot lately in our church, but it's all about making it fun. It's all about making something fun for the kids. Have you used that?
Or you know, to teach the kids. But also lots of fun.
But it's always in a group setting. It's always as a kind of, we never, we're
well, it's doing the same thing as a lot of churches do to pull in adult people to their churches. It's having fun things, having fun events and activities, but it's not drawing people to Christ. It's drawing people to fun activities and stuff.
Yeah.
And
it doesn't work so well for adults. That's why we don't talk about it as much for adult converts as we do for kids. But because adults, obviously, if they don't need to go to church to do something fun, but yeah, it's focusing on you. Obviously, you need closer relationships in mentor figures or disciplers if you're really gonna gain a deeper understanding of different things. You can't. It's hard to get a deep understanding of a lot of different topics just through group classes.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this before with adults, but it also applies to kids. Just as much.
I guess my perspective on like kids and raising them and kind of discipling them in Christ is more and more getting to be that they should be treated more like adults.
Yeah.
Which before I hadn't put a ton of thought into it, but just more and more based on things I've been reading and thinking about, I just see more and more that kids should be treated and mentored kind of like they're adults, because they shouldn't be like held at a lesser standard or a lesser level.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, within reason, but
and obviously there's like an age range. I don't know exactly where it is that these kids start to cross over, and then they start to become have more ability to think seriously, and I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't know exactly what that is.
It varies, but
it varies depending on maturity. But
I think kind of giving them that standard and treating them like adults, that will challenge them and kind of usher them into that state, rather than treating them kind of like kids until they're most of the way through high school or all the way through high school, you know?
Yeah.
Because then that's holding them to the standard of kids.
Then they have to make this jump and start acting like adults all of a sudden. And
usually the jump is not made very well.
Yeah, it's kind of an awkward leap for a lot of people. So, yeah, because if you think about it, we personally think that, or we like to hold ourselves to we would think ourselves as being not working for Christ if we were just to not do anything. Like we expect like kids, or like I'm thinking like high school, maybe middle school people. Their only mission as Christians is just to learn. But it's also to do. They're just as capable of doing as we are.
Yeah.
So I think for every Christian, it's both. You have to have a mix of learning and doing. And just having a large portion of your life is just learning, then you can lead to a shallower faith.
As Christians, we should not be consumers. We should not be. I hear this language all the time of even older Christians will even say is that you need to be fed. This idea of being fed. You go to church and you need to be fed. You're just passively like gorging yourself on spiritual thoughts and knowledge, and then you go home.
Yeah.
And I think that therein lies a lot of the problem too. Is well, what you're talking about. You need to both hear and do.
Yeah.
And the being fed is good. You need to, intake spiritual knowledge, but that's just the first part. If you do nothing with that knowledge, if you don't live accordingly, then you might as well not have heard.
Yeah, it becomes stagnant, and then it starts becoming meaningless.
Yeah, it does become meaningless.
And so, when it comes up happening, if you have a bunch of kids running around with knowledge they see as meaningless.
All the Old Testament Bible stories they've heard a million times.
Yeah.
Or even New Testament, and they just were connected to a bigger picture.
They never assigned value to them because they heard them a lot, but they never connected them to anything practical.
And we talked about this, I don't know how many weeks ago, but we were talking about people everyone using their individual gifts, their individual talents, and trying to find ways to use that for Christ. That should be what we're doing. We should be trying to find ways to serve, and if we're not doing that, then we need to start doing that.
Yeah.
Because it's not... Our faith is not based on works, but it's not a passive faith. You cannot sit by and let everything go and be okay.
Yeah. So, are you familiar with John Christ?
No, not at all.
Wait, seriously? No.
I don't think so.
Okay. Oh, anyway, so I just think we could move on, or we could start talking about, what are some churches doing that is, are trying to solve this? How are some churches trying to solve this problem? Particularly bigger churches. And there's a lot of stereotypes around this. Anyway, he's a Christian comedian, and he made a video about how this pastor had an outdated look, and so they sent him to this swag seminary where he learned to dress appropriately and have his shirt untucked. Gets the hair a little wilder.
Oh boy.
Anyway, it just he likes to he likes to show what's some weird things that Christians are doing that are kind of that we may not think that we realize that we're doing. But one of those is we start putting a lot of value in presentation and entertainment and.
Mm-hmm.
And
we've already talked about that a little bit tonight. Is one thing a lot of churches do is they see, well, we're losing people. I mean, this applies to young adults or young people and just people in general. We're losing people. We need to get them back by making things more fun. We need to have more programs. We need to
be more relatable.
A more charismatic kind of speaker. More elaborate presentations. A better worship band.
Yeah.
That's where a lot of them go.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously it's dangerous.
And it just undermines the reason that people are there in the first place.
Well, it brings people there for a totally different reason than they should be there.
Yeah, it definitely you can create a sense of accomplishment when you bring people in, but what can end up happening is you bring in a lot of people and they develop a really shallow faith.
Mm-hmm.
And then that church becomes even more shallow, and you start having a faith built on, well, it could be awesome music or something like that, but it's not really a faith. That's just it could just be a club at that point.
There's a quote by, I want to say it was by Tozier or someone. I'm not super familiar with him, but I just heard it from another source. But he said something along the lines of the goal, or what we should be striving for, is to have better Christians rather than more of them.
Yeah.
With the idea being, we put way too much weight and importance on congregation size and oh look, we're getting so many new people that we often kind of overlook the people that we have, and we don't focus so much on growth as we do on getting more people in. And really that's one of the main problems with churches trying to get more people is the only way to really get a lot of people in is to is to have a lot of really fun stuff, is to sell out the purpose and to attract people by other means.
And if you start thinking like, if you start having the mindset of trying to get a lot of people in, then you might also start thinking like, you don't want these people to leave either. And when you start thinking like that, then you start to be careful not to say certain things.
Ooh, yes, and you start the preacher has to start being political and taking into account what people's opinions are, and
or at least politically correct. And you got to start thinking, okay, I can't do this or this or this, or people might start to leave.
And that's especially an issue once you start getting like a really big church and you have a really expensive building and you have to keep getting enough money in order to support the building. And it's a snowball effect. And
you're scared if you really push these people from the pulpit, they will leave, and you know that.
And so we look at what we should be doing is not focusing on quantity so much, but focusing on quality. We want to develop stronger Christians. This is something we talked about with Benjamin last week, maybe after the podcast. Also part during it. The idea that churches should essentially be like small Bible colleges is what he said. We should be training people up, strengthening them, and sending them out. What do most churches do? Most churches are recruiting, trying to hire people to come in to speak for them, because we don't have anybody here. We don't have anybody who's capable of being a preacher. In a lot of churches, that's the case. The opposite of what it should be. We should be growing our members and getting that quality rather than the quantity. You look at what Jesus did. He was not at all concerned about quantity of people following him. Every time he got a big crowd and they were like starting to like really like, oh man, we're going to make him king or something, he would say something that they just totally couldn't understand, and he'd drive them all away. He would say, eat my flesh and blood. And then the people would be like, what? And then they'd go. He'd say stuff like that, and he kept his group down for the majority of his life to 12 guys and then some. I think at in the beginning of Acts, the day of Pentecost, they said there was like 100 or so of them meeting together. So maybe at max that was like his core group was like 100-something people.
Yeah.
We think about it that way. It's like, what was Jesus doing? He spent 3 years with 12 guys. 12 plus.
And then those, I guess we go into this, and then those 12 guys started multiplying.
Mm-hmm. And they didn't all just stay in one place.
Yeah, they moved
Well,
around.
they did stay in one place for a while, and then they started getting killed, and so then they spread. But they moved everywhere, and they were going to every city, and they were meeting in houses and things like that.
So I guess the question should be asked then: what would you think would have happened if Jesus hadn't done it that way? What do you think would have happened if he would have had started his church with all the people that were following him throughout his life, with those thousands of people that were just following and listening to his like Sermon on the Mount or whatever?
Well, they probably would have crowned him king and tried to. And then at that point, I don't know how much he would have been able to control them. They probably would have tried to start physically fighting against the Roman Empire. And it would have just been a massive war. He probably wouldn't have been killed because a lot of the people were expecting someone who was going to start a war and free them from the Romans. It'd be a completely different story. You would have a lot of people, but most of them wouldn't understand the deep concepts. Most of them would not have known what he would mean by things like eat my flesh and drink my blood. They would not have known all of his parables were specifically designed to go over the majority of people's heads so that only the people who were really listening, who were really thinking, would understand them. Mm-hmm. And then he explained them to his disciples because sometimes they went over their heads too. But parables were designed to only be understood by a few people. Mm-hmm. And so there would have been all these deeper things that, like, if he had all these crowds, the majority of people would not really understand.
Yeah, they would be blind followers.
They would understand Jesus the man. They would understand him as a physical person, as they would probably have made him a king. They would follow him, and that's as far as they would. They would not consider him to be the Son of God, probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think, as we've seen through the Bible and the New Testament, the example Jesus set for us was, like you said earlier, discipling individuals rather than leading a huge crowd.
Mm-hmm. And definitely, and when he was discipling, he's giving them, he's talking straight to them. He's not trying to do it by like, hey, we're having a ton of fun, come follow me. Mm-hmm. He's camping. He has nowhere to lay his head.
The guy that said, "Teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go," and he's like, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head."
Yeah,
he was literally told him up front, "It's not going to be easy or fun."
They had to give up. They had to leave behind their families. They had to live on the road. They probably didn't always, have a ton of food. Mm-hmm. They weren't living it fun. Jesus was not trying to distract them by all these external fun things, which is what a lot of churches do. He was just, here I am, follow me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He was also doing miracles, which some people, that's kind of, people would follow that, but...
yeah, until he stopped hitting them.
Until they wanted bigger signs. He's like, whatever.
Yeah, so... Like we've talked about, obviously, making your church more entertaining, more fun, more relatable, all this could have the illusion of success. In the long run, it doesn't actually lead to success because you maybe converting more people, but they may not have a very deep faith, and eventually they will fall away. So I guess if we were to speculate, what are some things, I guess, that churches, or what would be good strategies for churches to start taking?
Well, I think one of the most important things is, and this includes me, I'm not saying this like other people need to start doing this, I need to start doing this too, is focusing more on discipling, on mentoring and building people up. So you take the people who aren't as strong and you make them stronger. Mm-hmm. And the idea should be that in every congregation there should be a number of people who are fully capable of teaching, who are fully capable of, if they felt the calling, they could go and start a new church, essentially. Mm-hmm. That's the goal, is there should be Christians in every congregation capable of doing that. And there should be some people who are doing that, I think. And what that looks like is the more mature Christians are mentoring and building up the newer Christians. So especially if this starts with the elders, is the elders are doing this. They're watching out and making sure everyone is growing this way, and then that just propagates. It starts a spider web, a snowball effect kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think that to me is one of the biggest things that if we can get that right, then we'll be so far ahead of where we are, where a lot of churches are.
Yeah. And I think part of the solution is to just start being more real, which starts with not trying to get people to come for shallow reasons. And so we got to reverse. That's the and that's the first step of starting to be more real, is starting to try to get rid of things that are shallow and
you have to be very clear that just be very clear to anyone who's coming there. You're coming here for Christ. Mm-hmm. That is why you are here. His message is sometimes hard. It's going to convict you. It's going to and that's just the way it is. We're not going to change it. You're coming here for him, and if that's too harsh for you, maybe you need to leave. That sounds harsh too, but Jesus did the same thing, and the moment we start softening the message or softening what we're giving people is the moment the people also are soft, and that's not good. So yeah.
Yeah.
Cut out the distractions. Focus on the core, which is Jesus in Scripture. I'm going to say this kind of goes along the lines with discipling, though, is continually challenging people to go out of their comfort zones and kind of improve, right? Or take on new responsibilities. So this could be like the elder challenging a younger person to maybe lead a class, maybe lead a Bible study, or maybe even as simple as, I don't know, giving a short talk, like a communion meditation or something.
And I think, and more importantly, is starting to challenge people to actually build relationships and mentor other people into the faith themselves. Yeah.
So the idea of just challenging the people who aren't doing very much to start doing things. And I know, Francis Chan mentioned that actually the way he started out teaching people was an elder challenged him to lead I want to say it's like a group of young adult guys or something. Lead a group. And that got him started down a path that eventually led him to found a church that became a mega church, and now he's a kind of a celebrity preacher of sorts. But something like that leads to tremendous growth and can lead to future things. So I guess, and this is especially more a thing for the elders, I think, is seeking out the people who are maybe not serving and challenging them to serve in some way.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of, as we talked, I've kind of realized that a lot of the solutions for stopping young people from leaving the church is the same solutions that to stop people from leaving the church in general.
Yeah.
It kind of applies to both younger people and older people. It's just like, as I went back to the beginning, older people or young people are more susceptible to change and to seeing things that older people might not see as much. And so the same problem affects both older people and younger people. Just younger people are more sensitive to it.
Right.
That's how I see it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So, good talk. A lot of opinion discussion, but I definitely, a lot of these things have kind of been on my mind and heart recently, and it's kind of like a hard thing, I think, to start making the changes that are kind of required. Starting in my own personal life is like seeking out someone to mentor. Like, that is super outside of my comfort zone because I'm very much introverted, very much it's very difficult for me to just make that kind of leap, right? But I feel it's something we have to do, right? So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good discussion, definitely. It's good to hear your thoughts on it.
Were we passionate enough?
Yep. I'm very passionate.
All right. So I guess we've already kind of closed a little bit with some action points for things you might think about trying to implement in your own life, in your own church. Definitely something that can use a lot more thought, a lot more discussion, and a lot more reading of Scripture. But until then, you have anything else to say, Jonathan?
We should be good.
All right.
This has been Salt of the Earth podcast, episode 15.
Yep. Go and salt it up.